What happens when the flames die down but the smoke of injustice lingers in the air? When the hills of Calabasas turned into a sea of fire, the world watched in shock. Yet for those who lived there, the disaster was far more than a natural event. It was a terrifying reminder that celebrity mansions, ordinary homes, wildlife habitats, and fragile ecosystems all stood equally vulnerable. In the middle of this devastation, two of the most recognizable figures in modern culture, Kim Kardashian and Kourtney Kardashian, rose not just as reality stars, but as advocates for something bigger. Their fight for environmental justice after the Calabasas fire became a story the cameras could not script, a story where survival met responsibility. The Calabasas fire was not an isolated tragedy. It was a brutal warning. In a city known for wealth, luxury, and fame, nature reminded everyone of its untamable power. The inferno consumed not only homes and properties, but also forced thousands to confront the uncomfortable truth. Climate change is no longer a distant issue. The flames weren't just burning trees and brush. They were igniting conversations that many preferred to keep silent. And standing in the heart of this storm, Kim and Kourtney Kardashian made a choice that surprised even their critics. They would turn their fear and loss into action, demanding environmental justice. For the Kardashians, the Calabasas fire was more than a headline. As smoke filled the air and ash fell across the hills, they felt firsthand what it meant to be powerless in the face of nature's fury. They evacuated their homes like thousands of other families. They watched helplessly as neighbors lost everything. Yet unlike many, they also had the platform to speak to millions. What they chose to say, and more importantly, what they chose to do, shifted the narrative from celebrity survival to a fight for accountability. Kim and Kourtney were no longer just protecting their estates. They were stepping into the role of activists, determined to ask the question, who bears responsibility when the earth burns? The Calabasas fire highlighted an uncomfortable divide. On one hand, the wealthy could afford private firefighters and emergency resources. On the other, ordinary citizens were left to fend for themselves, relying solely on underfunded public services. Kim Kardashian famously hired private crews to protect her neighborhood, sparking debates around privilege, fairness, and inequality. Critics called it elitism. Supporters saw it as decisive action. But what cannot be denied is how that choice pulled attention to the gaping holes in a system meant to protect all. And it was here that Kim and Kourtney's fight for environmental justice found its roots, not just in saving homes, but in demanding change for communities far less privileged than theirs. Kourtney Kardashian, often seen as the sister most invested in wellness and sustainability, took the fire as a personal call to action. She spoke about the devastating environmental consequences: scorched land, poisoned air, displaced wildlife, and the long-term trauma left behind. For her, the Calabasas fire wasn't simply about rebuilding. It was about addressing the cause, why such fires are growing more frequent, more destructive, and more uncontrollable. The fight for environmental justice, in her eyes, meant more than rebuilding luxury mansions. It meant protecting the planet itself, the very earth beneath their feet. Kim Kardashian, always known for her global influence, brought a different dimension to the fight. With her unmatched reach, she amplified conversations around climate change and pushed the issue into mainstream awareness. She highlighted the need for accountability from corporations, governments, and policymakers who had ignored decades of warnings. In her voice, the urgency of environmental justice echoed far beyond Calabasas. For once, it wasn't about fashion or fame, it was about survival. She reminded the world that fire doesn't discriminate, and the destruction it leaves behind doesn't vanish once the flames are gone. The Calabasas fire turned their reality into something raw and unscripted. Entire hillsides were reduced to blackened skeletons of trees. Families searched through the rubble of their homes, salvaging what little remained. Wildlife fled in desperation, their habitats forever altered. The air itself, thick with toxic smoke, carried invisible scars into the lungs of children and elders. And in this haunting aftermath, Kim and Kourtney stood not as detached celebrities, but as mothers, daughters, and human beings shaken by the fragility of life. They could not simply retreat into silence. The fight for environmental justice had become personal. Their activism was not perfect, nor was it free of criticism. Many questioned the sincerity of their involvement, accusing them of using tragedy as publicity. Yet what cannot be denied is the impact they made by shifting conversations. When Kim Kardashian tweeted, the world listened. When Kourtney spoke about sustainability, millions reconsidered their choices. Their influence became a weapon, not for ratings but for awareness. And in a society where environmental issues often drown in political noise, even imperfect voices had the power to spark change. Documentaries often tell stories of activists who dedicate their lives to causes, working quietly in the shadows. But here was something different: two women, born into privilege, stepping into a fight they could have easily ignored. The Calabasas fire burned away the illusion that fame provides immunity. It showed that when the earth rebels, even the most powerful are left vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, Kim and Kourtney discovered their responsibility. The fight for environmental justice after Calabasas did not end with social media posts. The sisters pushed for stronger fire safety regulations, better resource allocation for communities, and deeper conversations about the connection between climate change and natural disasters. They invested in rebuilding efforts, supported local charities, and used their platforms to amplify the voices of those most affected. Whether you admired them or doubted them, one thing was clear: they were using their influence to keep the issue alive long after the flames had died. Walking through the burned hills of Calabasas months later, the silence was haunting. The once lush landscapes had turned into charred wastelands. Yet from that destruction, small green shoots began to emerge, fragile, defiant, alive. Nature, despite its wounds, refused to surrender. And perhaps that is where Kim and Kourtney drew their greatest lesson. Environmental justice is not about quick fixes or glamorous gestures. It is about resilience, persistence, and the willingness to fight even when the odds seem overwhelming. In a world often skeptical of celebrity involvement, their fight stood as both inspiration and controversy. Were they perfect activists? No. But were they necessary voices in a time of silence? Absolutely. The Calabasas fire forced them to step out of the roles assigned by fame and step into a cause that affects every person, rich or poor. Kim and Kourtney's fight for environmental justice was not about image. It was about survival, for themselves, their children, and generations yet to come. When future historians look back on the fires that ravaged California, they will see more than destruction. They will see a turning point, where conversations about climate change could no longer be dismissed. And perhaps, amidst those records, they will also find the names of two sisters who, against expectation, used their influence to demand accountability. The Calabasas fire may have begun as tragedy, but in its ashes grew a fight for justice that continues to burn brighter than the flames themselves. Because when the earth catches fire, silence is no longer an option. Kim and Kourtney knew this truth, and in their fight for environmental justice after the Calabasas fire, they reminded us all: the flames may fade, but the responsibility remains.